The evidence for evolution made easy. Geographic distribution. The geographic distribution of animal species across our planet matches what evolution predicts. As animal populations spread out into new environments, and particularly when some of them become isolated by geographic formations such as mountains, rivers, or oceans, those isolated populations tend to adapt differently than their ancestors, and new species emerge. Charles Darwin famously studied the finches and other animals that populate the Galapagos Islands, and noticed that they bear many similarities to those found on the nearest mainland in South America, hundreds of miles away, but also had significant differences, and also varied from island to island. This indicated to him that the finches on the islands were the descendants of birds that had long ago migrated from the mainland, and there they diversified into new species. This is one of the key discoveries that led to his theory of natural selection. It shows how the isolation of the islands and the differences of the environments allows natural selection to create new species. And we see evidence of this all over the globe, where animal species separated by geography are related but different from other species in neighboring areas. If you believe in Noah's flood, or even if you don't, but believe in a one-time creation within the last, say, 10,000 years, either way, you have to explain how all the animals spread out from a central point, but somehow knew to migrate in groups by phyla, family, and species. For example, Australia and New Zealand are populated with many species of marsupial mammals, which are those that have pouches, such as kangaroos, wallabies, and koalas. And there are very few endemic non-marsupial mammals, called placental mammals, found there, and few marsupials found anywhere else. The logical explanation is that they evolved in that region separately, after branching off from their common ancestor with other mammals. Or perhaps the marsupial just knew to march off Noah's Ark right down to Australia, leaving the placental mammals behind. Another type of evolutionary geographic distribution that clearly shows how evolution works is a phenomenon called ring species. There are many of these found throughout the world, and one great example is the Ensatina salamander of California. Ring species occur when a species becomes geographically distributed in a circular pattern over a large area, often around a physical barrier, in this case, the large central California basin. Immediately adjacent or neighboring populations of the species living around this ring vary slightly but can interbreed. But at the extremes of the distribution, the opposite ends of the pattern that link to form a circle, natural variation has produced so much difference between the populations that they function as though they were two separate, non-interbreeding species. While this is on a small scale compared to the grand scale of all of evolution, ring species demonstrate in the spatial dimension something that always happens in the time dimension: gradual change from a common ancestor. Evolutionary baggage. Man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Charles Darwin. When looking at all life that exists today, we can see many features that are clearly the result of our evolutionary past. One type of this evolutionary baggage is called vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are parts of animals, including humans, that have been inherited from their ancestors, but no longer serve the purpose for which they first developed. Examples include pelvic bones in whales, wings on ostriches, dew claws on dogs, and the human appendix. Notice that some of these structures do serve a purpose, And creationists like to say that if they serve a purpose, they must not be vestigial, but that is not the case. Evolution often works by repurposing structures that are no longer needed for their primary purpose. The important thing to notice is whether they are necessary, not whether they are useful. The wings on an ostrich, for example, are used for balance, display, and cooling, but they are anatomically equivalent to wings used for flying in other birds, and not used for flight. They are clearly not necessary for their survival. There would be no reason for a designer to give them wings that they don't use for flight. Other animals in the same environment get along fine without wing-like cooling structures. The evolutionary explanation is that they are left over from ancestors who did fly. Gradually, the ancestors of today's ostriches adapted to living full-time on the ground, and at some point lost the ability to fly, but retained their wings, and co-opted them for other purposes. Similarly, the human appendix may be used to some extent by our digestive and immune systems, and likely was required by our ancestors who relied heavily on a diet of leaves, but we certainly can live perfectly fine without it today. In fact, about 250,000 people per year must have their appendix removed surgically when it becomes inflamed. Without surgery, many of them would die. This shows that not only is the appendix not necessary, but we would be better off without it. Vestigial structures always prove to be left over from an ancestor that did use them for the primary purpose for which they evolved. Creationism provides no valid reason for these structures to exist. We also find many vestigial structures that start to develop in embryos, but disappear or change to a different structure later in development. For example, human embryos start to develop tails, and dolphin embryos start to develop legs. We know these are remnants of their evolutionary ancestry because they match up to the early development of these same features in related species that still develop and use them. In very rare cases, we find animals that are born with ancestral features not normally present in the species. These are called atavisms. They occur when an existing gene that is normally deactivated in a species gets reactivated by a mutation, allowing the ancestral feature to partially or even fully develop. Observed examples include dolphins born with legs, and even some humans born with tails, some of which even have articulated vertebrae and the muscles to move them. Only evolution can explain this. Also, there are no atavisms observed that evolution would not predict. We find no nipples on birds, or horns on apes, or anything of the kind that does not fit the evolutionary model. Another type of evolutionary baggage is what I would call bad design. Evolution works mostly by building on and modifying the structures it already has available, without the benefit of foresight or the ability to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch. And we see signs of this all through nature. A great example is the recurrent laryngeal nerve. This is a nerve in all mammals that connects the brain to the larynx, or voice box. Because of the way it evolved, it exits the brain, passes by the larynx, and loops around a major artery near the heart, and then back to the larynx. There is no functional reason that it loops around the artery, only an evolutionary one. It evolved in the fish-like ancestors of modern tetrapods, traveling from the brain past the heart to the gills as it does in modern fish. Over the course of evolution, as the neck extended and the heart became lower in the body, the laryngeal nerve was caught on the wrong side of the heart, creating an unnecessary detour. In humans, this is a small detour of just a few inches. In giraffes, the round trip down the long neck and back up measures about 15 feet. No intelligent designer would do that. If you are a male over the age of 50, you may have already experienced discomfort or pain caused by another example of bad design. The prostate gland is a reproductive gland in male mammals that surrounds the urethra. There is no functional reason for it to be wrapped around the urethra, but it is there because it evolved from tissues inside the urethra. Unfortunately, this gland is prone to infection and swelling later in life, causing difficult and painful urination, and in some cases, requiring surgery. No intelligent designer would wrap a gland that swells around a collapsible tube. If any of this evolutionary baggage really was the work of a designer, many of his designs are illogical, inefficient, useless, redundant, and even harmful. In other words, not very intelligent. But they make perfect sense in light of the way evolution works. Evolution actually does perform design, in a sense, but it is a bottom-up, stepwise improvement type of design, rather than a top-down, purposeful, and pre-planned design. And when you look closely at the natural world, this is very obvious.